audiences for a professorial inaugural that we've had for some time. So in these challenging moments, there may be some real lessons for us to learn in higher education. As creatures of habit, adapting to change can be slow, but the adage necessity is the mother of invention seems to be true in that necessity is now bringing about rapid change. And like other significant crises in the past, the coronavirus is shifting our patterns of behaviour. We're discovering new ways of conducting core business, such as giving an inaugural this particular way this afternoon. We've found solutions to rather old problems, and in doing so, well, we may be able to make the most positive shift in resolving perhaps another crisis, and that's the impact of the environment. Time, place, and space are being reconsidered by digital technology. In what ways and when we bring students together, and indeed staff together, now requires seismic rethinking in the academy. So this afternoon's inaugural celebrates necessary attention to learning and teaching in higher education. It's not simply what we teach and what we learn, it's how we teach and how we learn that is important in developing the necessary skills to go further. So it's therefore my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Megan Lawton. She's located in COLT, the College of Learning and Teaching here at the University of Wolverhampton. She was one of the first to gain her professorship at the University of Wolverhampton via a practice-based learning and teaching route. She describes herself as having an eclectic set of qualifications and professional recognition. Professor Lawton has a BA in Visual Communication Studies, specialising in TV and video production, a postgraduate certificate in further education, a master's in business administration, and a doctorate in professional studies in learning and teaching, focused on the use of developmental mentoring. In 2014, she became the first senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the university, later becoming a principal fellow in 2017. She's mentored many members of staff to gain their own recognition in learning and teaching. In 2017, she was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship for her work in developing academic practice, both in the United Kingdom and with transnational partnerships. She's taught colleagues in Sri Lanka and Burma and run many staff development sessions in the United Kingdom for colleagues from Chinese universities, including mentoring a colleague from Hebei University to become the first senior fellow in China. Megan is a consultant, assessor, accreditor for Advanced HE. She has been an external advisor and examiner for Advanced HE's accredited continual professional development programs and postgraduate certificates linked to learning and teaching in other universities. She's a research supervisor, director of studies for various doctorates. Her own research is currently focused on visual research methodology and flipped learning, very topical for now. She is also an active member of ALTA, the Arts, Learning and Teaching Research Group. So, with all that being said, we can now hear from Professor Lawton with her address entitled Intentional Content, Creating a Learning Exhibition Within a Flipped Learning Approach. Professor Lawton.
Hello and welcome to everybody. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint slide up from the beginning. Thank you very much, Ross. Wow, it's not often you can give an inaugural lecture when you've got your slippers on and when you just had to shut the window because a bee's flown in. Thank you very much for Deborah for doing all of the technical sorting out and for arranging this event. Thank you so much. And before I move on, I'd just like to thank all of my amazing colleagues in the College of Learning and Teaching within the Directorate of Student and Academic Services. I think I'm lucky because I work in such a creative, dynamic team who are always thinking about how things could be done differently and how we might enable others to develop their own practice. I really do appreciate your support, guys. I think probably the other people I'd just like to say thank you to, because I've just told my kids that they've got to come off the internet, is my family for staying off the internet for the next hour. That's a very difficult thing to do when you're stuck at home. So in this session, I want to really look at three main things. I want to introduce the model of flipped learning and then focus on two particular aspects of it, the intentional content and the role of the professional educator. I also want to offer a different way of thinking about planning an online environment. This is a kind of a learning exhibition. And then I want to consider the impact on academic practice and kind of really what does a lecturer actually do in that sense. Though before I go further, Ross has introduced me in some detail, but I want to sort of tell you two things about myself which really I think share my sort of traits and explains a little bit more about how I think. I am dyslexic and I'm a visual thinker. I'm a big picture thinker and I often end up sketching things, drawing maps, and I can't really make sense of things unless I see the whole sort of relationships towards things. This other image is so important to me. It's actually from my doctorate. I was really struggling to try and capture what I meant about a kind of a mutually beneficial relationship that was part of the work that I was doing and is part of my approach to academic development and staff development. I don't know if you know, but a clownfish, when it enters a sea anemone, actually rubs off nutrients and feeds that anemone. And in the what it gets back in return is it gets a sort of layer of mucus that stops it getting stung. As it goes in and out of the anemone, therefore, it's mutually beneficial to the plant and to the animals. And I believe that kind of, in some ways, says what I think about my own role in academic development. If I just stay put in one place, it helps no one. I believe that as an academic developer, I need to go out and engage with people in their discipline-based context. When I come back in, I get to share those nutrients, those nuggets of good practice with my colleagues. If I don't go in and out of people's practice, then I can rightly get stung for staying in my own department. So I think to me that sort of image has become almost like a sort of a logo for the way I work. I am, as I said, very visual. I've been doing a lot of work using visual methodologies. My own doctorate, I used soft systems methodology. I've done work with students on photo elicitation, auto-driven photo elicitation, and appreciative inquiry. And I'm going to look a little bit more about appreciative inquiry in a moment. As Ross said, I have a sort of a spiritual home for my research within the Arts for Learning and Teaching research group, and with a great deal of persuasion, because I'm a little bit shy about my writing because of my dyslexia, Ross managed to get me to write a chapter for this new book. And I think this is something that I had considered for an inaugural lecture, the idea of visual research methodologies, but that's another time, perhaps. The site for this piece of work that I'm going to be talking about today that really got me thinking is the Postgraduate Certificate in Academic Practice in Higher Education. A lot of us have these type of courses, and I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of this. All the students are obviously part-time work-based learners linked into the higher education sector. It's three modules of 20 credits at level 7. And each module has 3 face-to-face days, normally 10 till 4. And that's interesting at the moment to consider what that means. That it's mandatory for those who are working at the University of Wolverhampton without a recognised teaching certificate. But its key aims, we want to model and showcase different approaches to learning, teaching and assessment. We want to enable people to contextualise what we offer them to their own setting. And we want to encourage reflection on academic practice. it's also really important to create those opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. And I think now, from March 2020, all of this work has moved online. And I think this online creation for peer-to-peer learning is something that I think we are going to be looking at in more detail. I would just like to say the students on this course, at the moment we have 78 students on the course, on roughly 60 to 70 odd students each time. It includes PhD students who teach, people from support and professional services. We also have people who are teaching within the NHS. Obviously, for those people, they've currently suspended their study to go back into practice, which we really are truly grateful for them doing that. And we need to enable them to, as and when they're able to rejoin us. So thank you all for that. I'd also just like to thank my colleagues on the course to actually enable me to do all of this work, because we are very much a team and we support each other in the way that we design and look at our learning and teaching. I mentioned I'd come back to this image here. This is a very messy kind of way that I've actually started to look at refreshing the course, and particularly for work-based learning. I'm not going to go through the whole image, but just really to start off with, in the middle, my first question was, how do we make the most of the face-to-face time? And for me, this is absolutely key when we've got people who are in a work-based environment who are already teaching themselves. What were they going to get out of coming together? If it was just really a regurgitation of PowerPoint slides, what's the point? Orbiting around that sort of in the middle of the image was things like considerations about expectations, preparedness and interactions between both staff and tutors in the approaches to learning and teaching that we were going to be looking at. I think also then I really wanted to look at how both tutors and students would be engaging with each other and engaging with the materials. I have drawn very much on some of my work, which is to do with electronic portfolio and electronic personal development planning. So the notions of scaffolding learning, of patchwork text, of signposting and reflection has been really an important part of this design process. Now, I'm not going to go around the whole map because that would take too long, but what I needed to show was that it was about relationships, patterns and links between the different elements of learning and teaching. I would like to say that I started researching flipped learning before I started my map, but frankly I'd be lying. I actually came across this definition of flipped learning when I was actually trying to think more about what the different elements actually meant to me. This definition is from the Flipped Learning Network, and they have been a very useful source of information and a place where I've actually engaged with like-minded colleagues from across the world. And they actually do have a global initiative going on at the moment. It's a network that involves practitioners from schools, further education, higher education, right across the country. The things I found useful in this definition, if you look at the kind of the red bit, the change in the font, this moving away from direct instruction being the thing that happens in the group space and moving that to an individual space. That then frees up that group space and makes it available to be dynamic and an interactive environment, and particularly important where peers can talk to the tutors and amongst themselves. It changes, therefore, the way that the educator works. You're not the person in the front presenting information. You're the person who is guiding students to apply concepts and to engage creatively with that subject matter. And for me, that really gave me what I was looking for in terms of the sort of change of focus. Perhaps a little trite, but I think it's very memorable, is the notion of the 4 pillars of flip within this sort of flip learning network. The F, the flexible environment, and that can be a physical environment where things are moved around, but also flexibility of where students will study, when they would study, and perhaps flexibility within assessments to actually meet the learning outcomes. So a bigger version, a bigger view of what flexibility might mean. The L, the learning culture, moving particularly from tutor and teacher-led, teacher-centred models to learner-centred and learner-led models, where students are kind of independent. They can think and move around some of the materials, spending as much or as little time as they want within that. I think it's also useful to think about what Malcolm Knowles' principles of andragogy say here, and two in particular. You know, that adults need to be responsible for their own decisions and to be treated as capable of making self-direction. For me, that's an important part of who my learners actually are, and I need to be able to offer them opportunities for them to take that responsibility. But also that adult learners have a variety of experiences of life which represent a rich resource for learning from peers. I have learned so much from my students by engaging with them in a joint group dynamic space together, face to face. Obviously, at the moment, as I say, that face-to-face physical space is not happening. And one of my challenges with my students when I start teaching in about 2 weeks' time with them is to enable them still to have that peer-to-peer learning. The two bits I want to really look at are about this intentional content. And when I was looking at this material, what struck me was this notion of developing materials that students could explore on their own. And I think that exploration, that ability to go off and look at things and make your own way through things is actually something I really enjoy myself. And then the notion of a professional educator, not a lecturer, not a teacher, but something else. But within that we shift this direct instruction from the group to the individual space, and then how do we maximize that face-to-face time between us and students to students. So that's really kind of the framework from where I'm coming from. Over the 4 years that I've been working on this course with my colleagues, we've been looking at using an appreciative inquiry approach to actually evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing, and also then to inform us for any changes we would want to make. I think appreciative inquiry has been really useful because, as Glynis Cousin says, it's a way of researching learning cultures and academic cultures that's in a non-threatening way. You know, we are all of my students are members of staff, and they have that sort of duality of role. And I think it's really nice to engage with positive discussions about learning and teaching. And within those four frameworks, those four areas within appreciative inquiry, you know, starting off with discovery, what is it that works? Dream, what could we do better? What could we do differently? And then design, what should be happening? And then ultimately, destiny, what will be happening based on those things. So it's something that is a very dynamic approach. And ultimately, we ask the question, can flipped learning provide an effective pedagogy for academic development? And what, you know, within the appreciative inquiry, what do people like? We ask the students, and we've done this now over 4 years, to approach it from two different identities, to respond as their experience of being a student on the course, but also to consider themselves as teachers and how might that impact on what they do, and how they might take their learning from the course into their own academic practice. So the student questions are there, and the teacher questions were similar, but with a slightly different slant. From the evaluations that came out, one of the things that was really important, a big message, was could we give a model of a different way of designing the online environment? We have a new virtual learning environment, and that's been able to offer us a number of opportunities to do things differently. Previously, perhaps people have designed their environment week by week, and people did say, well, how could this be done differently? What could we do that isn't so tutor-led in that way. So I want to offer you a different approach, really, a kind of a learning exhibition. Probably all of us have been to an exhibition at some time, whether it's through college or at school or by ourselves and with friends and family. We go to something that might have a title that attracts us or offers us something that we think is exciting to see, and perhaps it's a very sort of special opportunity to go to see something you'd never seen beforehand. Here we have a bust of Augustus, admittedly looking a little bit startled, Banksy's Mickey Snake at the MoCA Museum of Modern Art in Amsterdam, and an exhibition from the 9/11 Memorial Museum. If you look at all of these, I think there's some various things I'd like you to consider. First of all, there's a design process that's gone on behind these exhibitions, and it's led to intentional content of that exhibition. And this is what I want to explore with you in more detail. Museums in particular perhaps bring to mind, my mind anyway, the idea of curation, and that's where I kind of started from. If we look at a definition of curation, it's the action or process selecting, organising and looking after items in a collection or exhibition. I like this kind of further explanation. The curation of an exhibition was informed by my experience as an artist. When I'm curating my online materials, I'm curating them from my experience of the subject area I'm teaching. I'm not just gathering willy-nilly bits and pieces that don't make a story, that don't give something that is cohesive. Digital curation, advanced HE, actually says is about the act of finding, selecting, grouping and contextualizing, preserving, maintaining, archiving and sharing digital content. And I think that is really quite interesting because it is saying that actually there's still the similar kind of process going on when we're looking at that digital content. So what is behind then that sort of exhibition design? I have to say I've got a little bit of experience of this when I did my degree and then working at Birmingham Museums and Art Gallery. So I think for me, first of all, an exhibition is planned. It's not just something that pops up. And within that planning process, you're going to be thinking, you know, what's the story I want to tell? What's the journey I want people who are going to attend this to go through? What goes where is something I would perhaps consider, and in what order. You're going to have many artifacts potentially to choose from. What's the one thing, what's the Tutankhamun's mask that you're going to place in a place of prominence that will draw everybody to that? Is there some concept, is there some idea that's absolutely fundamental to your online environment that needs prominence and needs to be placed in an environment where people have got time to linger and to look around it? Are the things that are going to have a relationship together that actually knowing one thing actually it links to another and then links to something else, and therefore might you want to put those things together to make a cohesive attraction for somebody to look at? So it is planned, it's selected. There are so many materials out there at the moment that we can use. What we have to do is perhaps within that selection process, think about what we're actually doing. An exhibition is presented, and I think this is quite interesting to think about. When we're actually planning a route, and I think for me, my online environment is very much thinking about this kind of flow and this journey that I want to take somebody on. When I'm planning it, what am I planning around that experience? I don't know about you, but I think it's really annoying when you go to visit an exhibition as a group and you have to follow a planned route or a tour guide. There are times when you want to just linger, to take a little bit more time reading something. Perhaps you want to go back to something and look in more detail. Perhaps there are things you want to skip. Now, talking to a colleague this morning, he suggested that that by using this sort of concept of a learning exhibition, we as lecturers might actually be the annoying tour guide that whisks you past the bits that you're interested in, doesn't allow you to follow your own schedule. And that's just really a thought. What's our role within this? So I might plan a particular route that I would want my students to actually go for. And if I'm planning and presenting that information, we look at a little bit more detail of one of the exhibits that I looked at earlier. In this exhibit in the 9/11 Memorial Museum, you've got narrative and you've got information within that exhibit, and that allows you to explore in more detail those things that you're wanting people to read about and look at. We have artifacts, and those artifacts could be an individual artifact, a group artifact, something that you are I don't know if I've lost my slides. Sorry, somebody has just taken my slides off screen. Deborah?
I've taken them off, but I don't know who's got them. Can you just press end share, Megan, and start again, please?
It's not allowing me to do that.
No, it's not allowing me either.
Right, I'm back.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Sorry about that. This is part of the learning curve of doing an online presentation. So, yeah, we've got 4 artifacts. We've selected those artifacts. And in fact, what we can do is use those artifacts for many different exhibitions. What you can't see because it's too tiny, but here are reflective questions. And as you move around the exhibition, it says, what do you think? And I think that's an important part. So you're not physically going to be there, the person who's designed this, but you can still raise questions for people who can take what they want from their experience. Ultimately, what I really like about this exhibition is that it's not static. There are contributions, reactions to, and responses that are refreshed as and when the exhibition is moved and changed and updated as it goes through. It can be rearranged to suit a particular time, a place, and an audience, but it's also useful for audiences to know that they can actually be an active person in that exhibition. So it's planned, it's presented. Ultimately, what I think is very important is within the exhibition that you've got that level of choice. I might have actually planned a route for you to go through, but you might actually say, I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to actually take a bit more time lingering over something that I think is really important or something I don't understand. I'm going to miss some of the bits because perhaps I don't think that's relevant to me, or maybe I think actually I already know about this. I'm going to go perhaps backwards and forwards, and I might even revisit the exhibition because there's something I really want to spend longer on that. So generally, you want to spend time reading, looking, thinking. The other thing I think is important when we're considering exhibition design as a kind of a model for an online learning is that it is a complete entity, that though it might grow with visitor responses, it is there in its entirety when you go into it. It could be really annoying if you visited an exhibition and they said, oh, come back next week and I'm going to release a little bit more of it for you. The whole point of this is about choice for you to wander around at your own speed, pace, and the way that actually makes learning meaningful for you. So how would this perhaps, or could this perhaps impact on our roles as lecturers? Alison King in 1993 was attributed with the sage on the stage or the guide at the side. But I'm thinking, is there something else other than those 2 concepts? I have looked at sort of that notion of content curation for an online environment. And I think this is kind of quite interesting to me. It's somebody who continually finds groups, organises and shares the best and most relevant content to a specific issue online. And I think that that is where I would want to see within this learning exhibition, that I am working with my students, responding to their needs, but also that I actually have something that is up to date, that it is accessible, that it's relevant, and it's not something that's necessarily static, but it is organised. In the HEA, it says also here that the value of a digital curator is the ability to scour content, transforming aggregated information into something new, constructing and reconstructing information to create new knowledge and to promote and support learning. I like that notion that we can take something. We don't always have to create new. There's a lot of stuff out there. If we then can work with that material and create a new learning experience around it, maybe by reflective questions, maybe by the text that we put with it, maybe in the relationship between another artifact and the artifact that we've actually shared, then we are becoming perhaps curators and exhibition designers for our students. I stopped and thought a little bit more about what I thought about my own role. I kind of quite like the term professional educator. It's what I always have to explain to people. Yes. Do I like the term lecturer? Probably no. And I'll perhaps I've got a piece of information that will say a little bit more about why I really don't like that term. But what do I do? Well, these are some of the things that I will do when I'm creating my online space, when I'm creating my teaching. Obviously, as a professor, I've got other things going on at the same time. I did look at things like, what does the term lecturer mean? And it's quite interesting to see what online definitions you can come up with. The thing I was horrified to find, I have a daughter who's just about to go to university, and I've been looking at some of the sort of information that students are told, and this is really scary from what university. 5 things you need to know about university lecturers, and some of them are really positive. But university is largely about learning. Yeah, great. So see lecture time as the opportunity to gain as much information as possible. Really? I'm not sure I want my lectures to be about just information. Lecturers will have a lot of slides to show you and not much time to do it. What they will have to do, as you can see, is read it. They will blast through these slides, leaving students confused in their wake. And then rest safe in the knowledge that most lecture slides will be put online for you to view later. I'm not sure that that's what I want my students to experience. In fact, I know I don't want my students to experience. And as this is kind of the information my daughter is being given about what to expect when she goes to university, I'm kind of quite horrified about that. And therefore, perhaps the term lecturer is not necessarily a term that really respects what we do now, and particularly in this environment that we find ourselves in at the moment. Probably many of us are not actually lecturing. So what are we doing? I mean, today I focused on intentional content, and I've been looking at working with a colleague for a different perspective of what we're doing. And we've been looking at that physical face-to-face situation. As I said, I'm dyslexic, and my colleague I've been working with co-authoring identifies as being on the autistic spectrum. One of the things we found is that actually that physical space I miss now in an online space, not having the ability to discuss with my peers about my understanding of something. With my dyslexia, I can very much get the wrong end of the stick if I don't discuss what I think something is happening and what something means. I have conceptual reversal, which can be quite interesting because I can get completely off at a tangent. I think Zoom and Teams can be interesting because that's given me back that little bit of ability to discuss and debate with people. I'm not very good at just pure online courses where I can't have that level of discussion and debate. for my co-author, the online environment is kind of calmer. However, they still have the same concerns about how to interact with others, and it can be a very daunting experience for somebody from that on the autistic spectrum to suddenly find themselves being put sort of on a video screen in front of a cast of thousands, and I know how they feel at the moment with where that's concerned. So we have a paper coming out next year about these kind of two different perspectives from somebody who's dyslexic and somebody on the autistic spectrum. And we really need to think about how can you prepare somebody to learn effectively in whatever environment you find yourself in. So for me, very much where I kind of want to sort of summarize, it's not what am I going to teach that I'm thinking about now. It's that intentional content, that learning exhibition. What are my students going to be exploring? And for me, that gives me a different framework. I want to really sort of draw a conclusion at the moment, but I would very much welcome you to carry on the conversation and to join us in the College of Learning and Teaching. And this is our Twitter address, where both myself and my colleagues will be happy to carry on those conversations at a later date. There are a few references here that I've been using through today, and I just really want to say thank you very much. And if we can now go to the chat group, Deborah, if you can tell me if there's any questions.
There's been quite a lot of conversation going on in the chat room about the distinction, how the idea of curation is really interesting, how important it is at the moment in the current times, particularly when you're looking at MOOCs and open resources. Comments about how the curator and the creator are very well linked, and how that might link to the modern music, how that might link to modern music, such as Tyler the Creator. There's been comments about finding your path and the distinction between maybe finding your own path and being led, and the distinction between deep learning and surface learning, and maybe a familiarity with the materials will lead to a greater comfort with finding your own path. So one of the questions that popped up at the beginning was from Jojo, and she asked, what would you say about the experience of students within flipped learning?
I think the important thing is to actually make sure that students understand the expectations, and that you do need a period of time when there's a familiarity and there's an orientation to that type of learning. And I think it is being very clear about the expectations. I think where, if I'm honest, I would have liked to have had a slightly different notion of what is teaching and what is learning, which allowed me to offer and engage with my students much earlier on than actually a notion of teaching starts on the first day when you turn up in front of me. This current environment has actually allowed me to do that. I've been able to work online with my students a good 2 or 3 weeks before I actually will be teaching with them and engaging with them. And that has enabled them to look through the materials, to actually start to think about what they know, what they're interested in. Before then, we have the conversations together as a group. And I think it is about orientation to this approach to learning. The other thing I'd say is not to be tempted, if students don't, inverted commas, do their homework, to actually go back and cover the material again that should have been covered before the engagement with a tutor. That really annoys a lot of people. It annoys those who have actually done the work, and also means that you are spending that interactive, that dynamic time where you should be looking at conversations, debates, application, just going back over that transmission of the knowledge that should have been engaged with beforehand. But it's about it's about the audience. It's about actually setting those expectations and being clear why you are doing it. In the course with the flipped learning approach, our attendance has been almost 100%, and people have actually, if they've not been able to come to the physical face-to-face days, apologies have been sent. They've asked for recordings, but of course you can't actually replicate very easily in a sort of a captured lecture, because those lectures don't happen. It's a dynamic space. It's about debate and it's about discussion. And that very quickly people realized they couldn't get that experience just by reading a book or just by going to look at a video. So it is about clarity, and it's about orientation and making sure, first of all, that people can access the materials, because that can be a real problem. But it's also being very clear about the philosophy behind it. It is very clear what is going into this online environment. That's that individual learning, and being very clear of what that face-to-face, that peer-to-peer, because it's not face-to-face, it can be, but it's not in a physical space. What goes on in that, and those two different activities are very, very different.
Janet Cash has asked a question. She said, could I ask how such content and digital curation might be introduced in business related subjects? So she'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, there's such a repository of materials to do with business, and I think one of the things I perhaps didn't mention is I set myself some parameters when I was looking at curating and finding artifacts. You know, I wanted artifacts that were no longer than, you know, I didn't want a video that was 20 minutes long. There are plenty out there. There are some wonderful TED Talks. But actually, if I was going to put an hour-long video in there, frankly, you know, would people look at it? So I set myself sort of 20-minute max. I then looked at, rather than a set of material that would answer exactly what I wanted, were the shorter pieces that I could use to put together to write materials reflective of questions around there. I also looked at diversity of message. So in one of the topics I teach, I've got videos from Delft University, excellent video on constructive alignment if you ever need one. 5 minutes, says exactly what you need to say. Groningen University, what do students think about teachers? Australian University, about teaching observation. And I tried to get over to students that it wasn't just a UK thing, it wasn't just a Wolverhampton thing that we were talking about, but these are discussions, these are issues across the world. I also tried to look and make sure that I had a diversity of role models within the video materials, that there were women, that there were people from ethnic minority backgrounds, that there might be many different messages. So it's kind of not just the same type of person who is presenting that information. And I think for business, it's also, you need to consider perhaps then within that, you have so many different people who can be talking, and the messages that they give may not be the full messages. It takes time to curate, but I haven't felt I've needed to create my own materials. There are plenty of different things out there. By curating and using other people's materials, it does make students realise there's a lot more out there. I think in business, it depends on, you know, there are so many materials. There are some dated materials. We all remember if anybody's ever done any business courses, John Cleese was, there was a lot of videos about business that he was involved in. And I think it would set yourself a set of parameters and just give yourself time to look to, and if it's, you know, I straight away look on YouTube, and if it's over my time period, I won't look at it. If it's from a particular slant that I don't really feel is appropriate, I won't take that further. So I think it is about really that selection process that you actually need to consider.
Thank you. Talib's asked about your thoughts around the order of learning and teaching and learning.
I always put learning first and then teaching second, because this is this move, I think, really for student-centered, student-led. What do I want my students to learn is the starting point for me. How am I going to enable that to happen is that second part. I do prefer teaching than lecturing. I don't lecture. I don't like that notion of just standing. I don't feel comfortable without having some kind of interaction with people. And though the term, is something that it is just a term, it just describes perhaps somebody's job role. For me, I want to think, how are my students going to engage with the materials? What are they going to be doing? So if I was to do, and I do teaching observation, I don't want to see a list of things of, the tutor is, I'm presenting this, I'm then doing this, I'm then doing that, because the students might be just sitting and listening and sitting and listening and sitting and taking notes. What I'd want to see is, what are the students doing? What are they actually engaged with? How are they being active within their own learning? So yeah, for me, learning comes first and teaching enables that learning to take place.
Thank you. Shaylee's asked for an example of a flipped learning session and how you would plan to adapt it for an online session.
Okay, one of the sessions that we start with is what makes a good teacher. And we've got a page in Canvas that students can, the Canvas is our virtual learning environment. So before the actual the face-to-face session, on that page is, first of all, I'm writing in the first person to my students. So it is not it's a piece of text saying, this is what I think makes a good teacher. What do you think? Embedded in that then are, as I say, videos from Groningen University of students saying what they think is a good teacher. There's links to online journal articles about what makes a good teacher. There are some different views from different people about what makes a good teacher. Those will all be read beforehand. In the face-to-face session, we actually ask people to then go into groups and to discuss what they think makes a good teacher. And then we ask them to rank what are the top 3 characteristics or traits. There was always a really interesting debate about whether it's subject expertise or it's good communication skills, which one is the top ranking, and that's normally the sort of discussion. After that session, we take images of all the students' sheets of information, and immediately we put them into the Canvas topic again, so it grows that experience. The students can actually see that their responses haven't just been lost, but they form part, and that's the co-creation of that activity. We also then link it, we use a patchwork text approach, so we link that experience to part of the assessment that they will then and have reflective questions around. So what do you think this impacts to how you believe learning and teaching in your own experience, that kind of thing. So it's a mixture of first person to the student, a range of different resources that they can access, around those resources reflective questions, and then linking it within that reflective questions to any kind of formative or summative assessment looked at beforehand, so that when they come, they have got some views and opinions, and that session is about them sharing those views and opinions. That's kind of where we would go with that. We don't have any of the online material is not written week by week. It's a learning exhibition. People can go into different rooms, different topics. They can wander around those rooms and those different topics. They can look at a range of different materials in there. If they feel something they feel they don't want to look in a lot of detail, perhaps they know about something in full detail, they can skip past it. But that won't be taken away from them. It is there in its entirety to start with. It can be added to, but it won't be taken away from.
Thank you, Megan. Lydia Arnold asks, I wonder how well prepared new colleagues may be to undertake such deep and challenging reflections about their role. Is it a good time to explore identity as a new colleague, or could it be overwhelming? What would you recommend as a strategy to facilitate these reflections with new colleagues?
I think that's a really good question. And I do think for many people, it comes back to this notion of what is lecturing in university like. And actually, it's about perhaps setting out your stall and working with colleagues, which is great within the postgraduate certificate, is that actually what we value is learning rather than you standing up and talking for an hour or 2 hours. And it's about myth busting that that's not what we want you to do. And that can be difficult for students and staff, because the students, might think, oh, I go to university, I rock up and I go into a very large lecture theatre, I sit there and I listen to somebody drone on, and then I get up and walk out. Now, that's not really what we want our students to do. We want them to engage with the materials. So I think it is about starting off from very early on to set out what you actually think. What's your philosophy of learning and teaching within the university? What do you value? What do you want people to do? And I think it is important that you give staff permission to know that we actually want you to be creative. We don't want you to necessarily lecture at somebody for that period of time. So I would have said as early as possible to make sure that you are actually supporting colleagues, mentoring them to be student-led rather than teacher-led in terms of learning and teaching.
Thank you. Elaine Kirkham asks, what are appropriate ways in which to link co-constructed learning with dynamic assessments?
I think that's an interesting one. I mean, ultimately, when you're talking about dynamic assessments, an assessment, you are measuring those learning outcomes. How those learning outcomes are met could be in different ways. So we do offer choice within the assessments to meet the learning outcomes. We have, somebody can actually write a reflection, or they could do a video reflection, or they could reflect in some other format. It's not necessarily the type of assessment that you actually want to meet those learning outcomes. It's about how do you know that those students have actually met those learning outcomes. So to have a dynamic approach, I think, is about also choice rather than being kind of constrained. I mean, one of the things we are looking at the moment, the sort of debates and discussions, suddenly, instead of my daughter doing A-level exams, it's all going to be based on the coursework she's done. It's all going to be engaged. It's going to be based on the engagement she's had with her learning. Suddenly, that's okay to do. Beforehand, you had to do it by exam. And I think it is challenging us in this current climate to really stop and think why we are doing things the way that we actually are. My son has just said that he's been told at his university that they are going to have to do an exam, but it's going to be over 2 days, and it'll be 3 hours within those 2 days. The length of time that's probably taken somebody to think about that. Why is it time constrained? Why does it have to be in that when you've actually said it can be done within 2 days? It just makes no sense to me. So I think we do need to think, if we're being dynamic in our learning and teaching, how can we also be dynamic within our assessments? And actually, we could probably be more creative than we actually are to enable students to evidence that they've met those learning outcomes.
Thank you. We've got lots and lots of questions, which I'm afraid we're not going to be able to answer all of them. As we said earlier, we will put some answers to all your questions onto the web page once we upload the video. But Adam's got a really interesting question about how do you prepare international students coming from rote learning backgrounds?
I think that's a really interesting question. We do have a lot of students who are members of staff coming from international backgrounds, and they have been absolutely fantastic in actually discussing and debating from their previous experiences, going back to our sort of andragogy, that actually, you know, at your peril, you ignore your students' previous experiences. And it comes down to really thinking about what's the essence of the learning. If it is the ability to regurgitate knowledge, then rote learning might do that. But if actually it's about application of knowledge, if it's about creation of new knowledge, if it's about critically evaluating things, then that's not going to happen through that framework. So one of the things we've talked closely with our international students is the qualifications sort of framework, which might leave a lot of people really cold, but actually it does say what the essence is of an undergraduate program. And the essence isn't about knowing stuff, it's about application, it's about use, it's criticality, and it's about explaining to students that this is what you want, this is what we want from you, and therefore we're going to enable you to develop those skills to be able to do that. But if you only lecture at them, you're not actually enabling and giving them opportunities to develop that criticality. So I think it's that bigger picture that you need to get over to somebody. But it is about explaining why and giving a rationale of why we're not going to do things through a rote learning experience. And that's not to say it doesn't have its place, but actually you do need to be clear what the rationale is of what you want somebody to do and why you want to do it. If you don't offer them those opportunities, you know, that's your basic constructive alignment, that you're actually the learning activities that you're doing, if they don't allow people that to develop those skills, well, then you've got a mismatched course.
So I've just picked one final question, which is from Jay, who says, as an academic developer working in education who has dyslexia, I'm grateful to have a role model like you. However, have you found this aspect of your, sorry, this is my dyslexia kicking in there. Have you found this aspect of you a strength or a challenge?
I now see it as a strength. I didn't perhaps at one point, and that was because I felt I had to fit into what I perceived as an academic framework that didn't work for me. I've always been very shy about my writing, and I could present to the cows come home, but to actually sit down and write something and feel that somebody was going to judge me by the level of English, that actually froze me from doing things. I have a very supportive line manager, and that made a huge difference to me, to know that I could go to somebody and actually go, I'm thinking this. My doctorate made a huge difference when I used soft systems methodology. I'd never come across it beforehand, but it allowed me that visual thinking space to actually say, you know what, I'm going to conceptualize, I'm going to draw pictures, and I have become more confident to be able to go, you know, this is me, this is the way I work. It's not better, it's not worse than the way you work, it's just different. This is the way I will work. I did get assessed with my dyslexia, and I'm very glad I did, because there's lots of things I didn't know. I like my conceptual reversal. My colleagues are great because they put up with me sometimes starting a conversation and changing mid-sentence to a different conversation. I don't know I've done it. I now know I do that. But also I think I now know more of my strengths, and I perhaps beforehand only saw my weaknesses. And I think you have to kind of own it, but also to be, I found it's helped very much. I tell my students I'm dyslexic, and if they see spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes, at the moment, I've had to respond quite quickly to change from face-to-face to online environments. There are going to be mistakes. It doesn't make me a lesser person. It doesn't make me less intelligent. It just means that I haven't been able to check it. And I also can't see my mistakes. I think there are many people who don't understand where people who are dyslexic are concerned. You can't teach me about my mistakes. I don't see them. I miss words out. I miss endings of words constantly. I used to work in the School of Languages. I could never spell language. I always spelt it LNA. I know it's not like that, but I can't do it. I don't see those mistakes. So I think actually being a bit more, I'm confident because I'm supported and well supported, but I'm not apologetic for the way I do things. And I think that is something that as you get to be perhaps know that what you do has a validity and is respected, that can help. You've got huge strengths. I mean, my strength is creativity, and my strength is that I can think big picture. Then I need to move on because I'm not that brilliant at detail, perhaps.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to now hand back to Professor Ross Pryor, who's just going to close.
Well, thank you, Megan, for a very interesting, stimulating presentation. I've also loved reading the meeting chat notes, which, you know, that's a dialogue that's happening live while you're presenting, which I think is equally important. And it does, your talk does make us think about how differently we can do things. We all know that in lectures, students are often checking Facebook and emails. The same might be true for staff meetings as well. So this says that we should be doing something new. This time, this crisis is inviting us to really rethink about what is important in education, to hold on to the things that do work, but also to think about how our new learners, the younger generation, are actually learning constantly themselves through a digital platform. People of our age went from zero digital technology, basically, having to cope with what we're doing today. We've been amazing adapters and great learners ourselves, but the younger generation, they're born into it, and we need to adapt and change our way of working in higher education. So a very timely presentation, Megan. The forces must have been with us all for this. You've prompted us with that metaphor of curation, and we can think about that and develop those ideas and think about how we might do things differently going forward so that there's a real legacy after this coronavirus. So on behalf of everyone in the room, thank you very much and all the very best for your future as a professor. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you very much. And I hope to carry on the conversation with a number of you after this event. Thank you.
Goodbye all.
Thank you. I will upload the video as soon as I have opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much, Deborah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. I loved that. I'm sorry I'm being bold, off mute.
Okay.
Bye.
Really loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. It was a great way to end my day.
Oh, thank you. It's been, I'm really grateful for all of you joining me this evening. It's been really good to have a conversation. I hope we can carry it on.
That exceeded all my expectations.